So this is maintaining open source, or how I learned to stop worrying and love dealing with grumpy people. Credit to my housemate Simon for the great title. So I'm Nick, I'm a developer at thoughtbot. We're a consultancy that works with a broad range of clients, some small, some quite large, like who I'm working with at the moment. But we're mostly known for a mix of our blog, which is giant robots. I always love this one because I myself will Google something and then come across the company blog, and I do this quite a lot. It's quite fun. There's a slide later on where I used a frequent search of mine related to the company blog. I'll point it out later. But we're also known a bit for our open source work, so FactoryBot, laptop, our dot files, and a bunch of other stuff that we've done too. And over the last couple of years, I've taken over maintaining a couple of these open source projects, and that's what I spend nearly all of my non-client time on these days. By non-client time, I mean investment days. These are a day a week that we have. It's typically a Friday where we get to work on projects which invest in ourselves, the company, or the community as a whole. We've had people join protests recently. We've had people run meetups, help organize conferences. We organize a conference in Austin, Texas called Keep Ruby Weird. That takes up a bunch of our time, for example, for those people in Austin. And personally, I use it for maintaining a bunch of open source software. But as a 15-year-old company, this hasn't always been the case. Back when we started a lot of our early open source efforts, it was mostly between projects and in evenings and weekends. But I maintain this thing, administrate, which is a non-domain specific language approach to building an admin interface in a Rails app. I also maintain shoulda matches, which is helps make writing some forms of tests a little bit more concise, and appraisal, which makes it easier to test against different dependency versions in Rails. Both administrate and shoulda are often used in internal projects, and we basically don't know who's using them. But I often see appraisal here and about when I'm browsing different projects, and you'll see, there's an appraisal file, and that's kind of nice to see. As a maintainer, I think I'm pretty terrible at it, but somehow people keep using all of these things. If you've opened an issue or contributed to a PR in the last month or so, I've probably not seen it, which is almost very similar to my email inbox. But before we go on, let's talk about a bit about what we mean by open source. Nearly all, if not actually all, software is built on a foundation of freely available code written and maintained by communities of people all around the world. And when we talk about open source, these days, we might think about GitHub. It has issues and pull requests, forking, so forth. But for a long time, this wasn't quite everything. Projects have been built around mailing lists, forums, blogs, email. The OpenBSD project survives pretty well on sending patches back and forth over email. This is a patch. This is the one which I had to look up on the company blog to work out how to do it, because I can never remember the arguments for git format patch and then the SHA. But basically, the idea with this is that you can make a change to part of the code, and then you can just email somebody, and then they can apply it themselves, and you don't need to have any other connection between each other whatsoever. But people who maintain projects, some of those are paid to do so, either directly, like I kinda am, or as part of their usual job. But the most vast majority of those do that in their own free time. Most of those who use open software just use as is, for example. Many libraries we use without thinking of contributing back, often because we never need anything extra from it. I've been doing this a lot lately with my current client project. I'm working on an Electron app. It involves React. It's got a bunch of Node.js and a bunch of other libraries because it's Node. But so far, I've not had any need to contribute back. And I rotate off the project at the end of the month, and I probably won't in practice, because I will probably not come back to anything Electron, React, and Node in that combination again for quite a long time. But people maintain or contribute to open source software for various reasons. Sometimes it's marketing, sometimes it's a company built around that project, Sometimes it's just fun to collaborate with people asynchronously all over the world. But overall, though, the more people that contribute to open source software, the more software gets better, and so do those contributing to open source. And someone has contributed to several projects. I've seen lots of different ways of approaching problems, and this exposure has definitely made me a better software developer. Most of the projects I maintain, I didn't start them. The projects I've started, they've mostly just helped me and maybe a handful of other people. So like I've written a bunch of API clients. I've maintained my doc files for like nearly 10 years at this point. So I can't really tell you about what makes projects popular. That's also not really where most of the labor in open source is. Mostly keeping stuff going, reviewing pull requests, replying to issues, setting the direction, and attempting at least to try and build a community around what you've been working on. All I do know is that popularity is some vague combination of luck and timing. You can't really predict when either is going to happen. For administrate specifically, it came a bunch of time after various other competitors. I don't really have to think about them as competitors because I think there are lots of different approaches to solving different problems, and they're all of equal standing in that regard. But it came along a bunch later. It tried to avoid some of the issues that some of the other approaches like active admin might have come into, and for various reasons that's helped boost it along and make it much more successful than it would have been otherwise. So once you have some users, then you get the real work. And I got started to administrate after getting annoyed by some grumpy comments left on an issue thread. Something was along the lines of, is this still maintained at the light end, to implying some hostile neglect on the other. And in practice, the original maintainer had just switched jobs. They went to go and work for the US former GDS, and I think they moved across the country at the same time. And as I went to go and pick it up, others had tried too, but some of my efforts somehow stuck, and I ended up just getting into it much more deeply than others had been able to. And my approach to this was basically, I started closing off old and invalid issues, then old and invalid pull requests, and then there's a bunch of low-hanging fruit. So documentation, internationalization fixes, some pull requests where someone had done a great job already, and maybe help fix a Rails version incompatibility, that kind of thing. And then started to become some of the harder work, like what should fit in the next release, what should the next release be, when should that release be, what should we focus on documenting, what can we break? It's pre 1.0, it has been for a while. It's actually something I'm working on at the moment, is trying to solve that. It's like, okay, what does a 1.0 look like? So now I'm doing more of what you probably consider a product management role in that regard, because it's a product effectively. And then the bigger one is like, how do I find time to sit through and review all these PRs? When someone contributes a large PR, it takes a lot of effort. I think it's really important to balance out the amount of effort they put in with the amount of effort you put into helping try and get that PR merged. And now, some 2 years later, I'm still pretty much doing all those same things. Administrate is almost by definition a broad project. As a user, you add it to your Rails application, then use some generators to build some models. No, the other way around. Then use generators to build dashboards for your models, and then we try and avoid as much magic as you can, but try and make it, but still keep it being helpful. I'm really messing up my words. Look at that. The idea really is that they're fundamentally a Rails controller, and you can override bits as you need them. And we're trying to avoid as much magic as we can, solve some of those issues, and at least aims to make life a little bit easier. Over these past 2 years, I've begun getting a lot more interested in what healthy projects look like. And I think there's two angles to this. One is from a user standpoint, and the other is from a maintainer's. They don't necessarily sit opposed to each other. They're just different metrics by which we can track things. So I put this little thing together. This is the kind of thing that I've considered as a user of open source software and also as a maintainer. So users who then ideally become contributors should feel feel welcome to open new issues. And they should have their PRs reviewed in a friendly and timely manner, and there should be a regular release cadence. You want to know when new versions are going to come out and how to schedule that in. If we break a bunch of stuff, it's going to cause downstream a large amount of work. If you have a regular release cadence, you can start relying on that. Ubuntu does this. Node has just started doing this. So Ubuntu releases, is it once or twice a year, and then every couple of years is an LTS release. You can then reduce the amount of big changes, but you can at least see the new stuff that's going on. And Node has just started with having an LTS kind of concept as well. So you can, I think the current one is 9 and 10 changes a bunch of stuff. So you can, if you sat on that for a while, you'll be okay, for example. And then from a maintainer's point of view, it's you want people contributing changes, and you want people chipping in via open issues. You don't want all the maintainers to be the only people who respond to issue threads. You want other people to chip in and be happy to try and offer their help. And generally, you want fewer regressions. I think it's just the case with most forms of software development, though. You don't want someone coming back and say, oh yeah, you did this, but this other bit fell off and broke, and that doesn't make anyone feel good. So additionally, as a maintainer, you end up feeling a certain obligation to your users and contributors. Sometimes this feeling is at odds with the rest of your life, and you don't feel like you can step away from stuff, and then you end up basically just being very likely to overwork to keep up with everything. And then if you're not careful, this can lead to burnout. It's the same as anything. But fortunately, related to all of this stuff, there's some documented methodologies for tracking project health. A woman named Nadia Iqbal has written about this extensively. She wrote a report for the Thorn Foundation that documents a bunch of this stuff and is a collection of a bunch of research. It discusses a bit about magnetic versus sticky projects. So the analogy given in that piece of research is that Homebrew, the macOS package manager, is a magnetic project. Lots of people contribute to it and come from different angles, and there is a decent set actually of maintainers on that project, but lots of people are making contributions. And then at the opposite extreme, Django, the Python web framework, is given as an example of a sticky project. So the maintainers of that have been there. One person I know has been on there since the very beginning when he was co-founding the project, and is still making changes now. But they have less contributors. They don't have very many at all, but the contributors they do have been there for a very long time. Something interesting about some of Iqbal's research has been coming up with what an ideal project might look like. So the idea of having an issue 0 or pull request 0, which peaks and closes regularly. So if you look at a project, unlike the projects that I showed, have a lot fewer PRs open, but you want the position there to be some sort of change. You don't want the project to be dead. You want people to be contributing, but you don't necessarily want so many changes all the time that you can't keep up with it. From a contributor standpoint, you want a reasonably fast feedback cycle, and from a maintainer's point of view, you want those things to come through and get merged in as quickly as you can. So I previously mentioned our investment time as how I spend my time working on open source. Fortunately, it's not really quite that simple. In practice, there's always other bits that I need to do on a Friday, being London team retros, interviewing people, other stuff that I might like to look at. I got interested in Go a while ago, so I've been working on some Go stuff sometimes, and of course that takes up a bunch of time. So happens in practice is that I might end up with perhaps a morning a week to really spend on stuff. And this in practice means that you look at stuff at other times during the week, usually an evening or two is taken up by spending time doing open source work. I've heard of organizations do various similar things to us, but also other organizations specifically allocating time to work on contributing back work. It's a bit similar to what the kind of discussion you might have in convincing like a delivery manager, for example, on we do need to spend time working on some of our tech debt problems to help us through into the future. And these time constraints are made worse by other expectations. Some are imagined or real. This refers a little bit, I guess, to the burnout stuff I mentioned. So I find most expectations are strong around new Rails releases. Inevitably something will be broken, or we'll have a deprecation warning, we'll need to fix it and cut a new release. And the Rails contribution guide actually has a nice approach on some other stuff like this as well. So I'm not going to read it out, but it basically says that everyone has problems and we're not here to solve these problems for you, but you have a platform in which to solve these issues yourself, which I quite like. The decent amount of criticism given to some large companies who take open source software but never contribute anything back. One of the more difficult things is what we could call unseen infrastructure. It's like stuff that's here, but you don't know whether or not anyone's using it. And I like to think of OpenSSL here. When Heartbleed happened, we realized that there's one full-time maintainer. It's like one person and a couple of other people, but this one full-time maintainer, so he was basically employed by the project, but employed on like a third of the rate that a normal software engineer might earn in America. So it's like hard for them to spend the full time, and also it was written in some C that wasn't the easiest for anyone to understand, which is also partly how we got into the problem we have in the first place. So the thing with OpenSSL is like, it's in my phone, it's on my laptop, it's everywhere here. Like it's there. We built stuff on top of it. Ruby's got it, Python's got it, Node.js it's included in that as well. And you probably don't know it exists unless you've made an SSL certificate. And until you start thinking about like, okay, where is this placed? You probably didn't realize that. And this is a common trend across technology as a whole. It's a quintessential example of the tragedy of the commons. We're all at some point a free rider. We're all using resources shared among everyone, but we're rarely contributing back, and because someone will, right? Like someone else is going to pick up the slack for us. But to avoid being too much of a downer, maintaining some of these projects has been some of the most rewarding work I've done. There's nothing like getting a first-time contributors PR merged, only having them to come back again in the future, and open a new PR, and some of that fun has been in internationalization PRs. So I don't speak any language apart from English, which when you've got a project that has a lot of translations is quite difficult to do. I don't know how grammar works really anyway, because the British school system. So when you take that situation and then you go, okay, here's lots of other different languages that do stuff in different ways, it's like, so we had a fun PR a while ago. At the time, we were working with a startup in London, it's an education startup, who happened to have a Russian-speaking software developer there. And so I roped him in to help with a Ukrainian PR, and he went through and explained broadly how Ukrainian works as a language, because it's quite similar to Russian. But he also found it quite funny that Ukrainian is like a really old-fashioned version of Russian, which I think is quite funny. And sometimes people tweet nice things and chip in and help, and that's pretty great. I like that. There's a few things we can do to make maintaining stuff better. I use a tool called Octobox. This is actually my current amount of GitHub notifications. There's, I don't know what that is. Was it? It's about 180 something, I think. I do this so I don't get this in my email, because that would be terrible. It would be really, really bad. And additionally at Thoughtbot, we use GitHub for a lot of other stuff as well. So we track our company handbook on GitHub. So all of our company policies are listed there, like how we go about working on projects and advising projects and so forth. So I contribute a bunch to that as well. You can see the handbook at the bottom there. But nearly all of them on there are all administrate related. Nice new feature. It's not actually that new, it turns out. I've been meaning to add these to administrate for a very long time, and I still haven't actually done it. But I think, as most of us might already know, dealing with end users, they're not necessarily very good at opening good issues. They don't quite, sometimes it's because they don't have enough context on the project, so they don't quite know what they need to provide and so forth. So issue templates provide a way to prompt people to, say, create a demo app. That's something I always hope for. If you give us a demo app with administrate installed, some basic models, and then go, okay, we get this error and I can run it myself, that solves so many problems and works really well. And then we've also got bots for stuff. Bots are really handy. Humans react so much better to getting told off by a robot than they do a human. And I think this one specifically is the stale bot, and it talks about, it complains when it's stale and goes, if you don't reply, it's just going to close it automatically. But it's something I've seen a lot of cases elsewhere as well. If you think of style linting for projects, that always works better if you just fail the build, rather than having someone go in on the PR and going, oh, you didn't do this right. And if you move a lot of that stuff out, we can have better human conversations and automate all the stuff that's not actually particularly very interesting. And some of this is just make it easy to run. So I mentioned CI just then. We do a lot with CI on administrate. We use Circle. I've not written this blog post yet, but I will eventually get around to doing it. I worked out how to run it against different Ruby versions. So we run against all the current Ruby versions, which are supported by the Rails versions that we support. So you can tell when you use some syntax that isn't available to us all yet. And additionally, on administrate, we use Heroku review apps. So we spin up a different version of administrate for every user who opens a PR, because it's as much as a website with documentation and a prototype app as it is a library. And more of a philosophy for how we get on top of issues and pull requests. It's like always be closing. If we have a healthy project and we define that by something which has frequent resolutions, they don't necessarily have to be perfect resolutions, but we have some sort of forward progress. And it's important to say no as well. So Solomon Hykes is one of the co-founders of Docker. And I quite like this. It's no is temporary, yes is forever. I can say, no, we're not going to merge your PR right now, but we might come back to it in the future, because maybe right now it doesn't fit the vision of the project, doesn't fit our priorities. But if you do merge it, you have to maintain it forever, or you have to work out a way to split it out into a separate project. So it's better to say no and move on and try and move the project in a direction than it is to just keep, yeah, sure, we'll do that, because if you'll never actually achieve anything. Jessie Frizzell, who's also done a bunch of Docker work, she works on a lot of Kubernetes stuff these days, also has a great post about this, which talks about different ways to close issues. One of these is the ego stroke and close. So really go, yes, really great job, but not right now. Or the just close it early, like as quick as it opens, just close it as soon as you can. Or the push to try again. You say, okay, we're going to close this for now, but if you'd like to try again, please do. And the other one, which is something I do quite a lot, is taking over patches. I find when someone's opened a PR and it's been open for quite a long time, that they go away and they probably don't come back again. So I'll often take over their branch, tidy up a bit, get it ready to be merged, and then merge it in, sometimes as a new PR. And if you're careful with Git, you'll keep the author the same, and so you keep the attribution, which I think is super important for open source. So there's an interesting thing about building communities around open source. This is a sales funnel. It's the same concept you get everywhere. So amount of interested parties eventually gets reduced as they get on the hook a little bit more, and eventually the amount of people who actually make a purchase are smaller. And it's the same for open source projects. A lot of the projects where I've done of my own, where no one's actually contributed anything, it's basically because there's not enough users. You need thousands of users to get a handful of contributors to probably get one or two maintainers. And unfortunately, it's just kind of the way it is. It's more of a factor of the way humans behave rather than anything else, which is why this is quite a ubiquitous way of describing these kind of problems. There's also been a push for first-time issues. So issues where someone can have most of the problems figured out already, so it can make it easier for someone to contribute. Personally, not quite so sure about this. I fear that it would cause more drive-by contributions rather than encourage people to sit down and try and understand a problem to solve. And part of this is the fun in developing software is in figuring out problems, then breaking it down, and then writing the code. Like the code bit's not actually that important or that fun half the time. It's really about the thinking process you take through going around that. And finally, on building communities, there's a new concept that I'm interested in and I haven't done, and I'm curious to see how it will work. And it's the idea of open source. So open source pretty much means someone contributes, you add them as a contributor to the project, and they have commit rights and can do what they like. In practice, you basically find that people will do the right thing. So this pushes more onto the community to pick up themselves. So slightly more in-depth issue, which kind of covers a lot of stuff overall. Is like, how do we go about funding open source? I mentioned previously some of what I'm paid to do is covered by it, and there's some new interesting ideas here. One of them is this thing called the Community Compact, which was described last month by Adam Jacob, who's the CTO of the company behind Chef, which is a configuration management tool for servers that's written in Ruby. It described this new sort of license where the purpose was to push a better relationship between companies trying to make money from software and the sometimes opposing groups contributing changes. And the concept centers around founding a business to contain the product itself, and then subsequently different licenses that you could provide for, say, a consultancy or a hosted service, or those requiring support contracts. And the idea here being that someone building a consulting business around a technology would contribute back either financially or with code contributions, or maybe both. I mean, that's probably ideal. And I do think this is an interesting concept, and it acknowledges that fundamentally we're a group of people building something. We can use social pressure that we would use in lots of other places to enforce a kind of compliance. So it's very similar to acknowledging an event's code of conduct, or just how we behave down the pub. We have a certain way of doing the pub in the UK that doesn't work in other countries. So you go to an American bar and try and behave like you're in a pub, you'll never get served. So there's another slightly older concept called License Zero, which describes a derivative version of the BSD license, which is one of the more permissive open source licenses, which includes a clause on payment for non-use, for profit use. So someone using a project would have basically 90 days to to use it before committing to paying for a commercial license. And the idea here is that another open source project could include it if they like, but someone making money from it, from that use, would not be able to do that, so they'd have to pay for it. And open source core, which is the most common model I think we do actually see. So this is the case for Nginx, Elasticsearch, Redis, and a bunch of other stuff. And my problem with this as an idea is that the incentives aren't necessarily aligned. To force an organization to pay up, the founding company might have to restrict the functionality that you can otherwise access. This happened with Elastic. It doesn't have an admin interface, you have to pay for that. For Redis, you don't have some of the clustering capabilities, you have to pay for that. And that's the only way to make those kind of businesses sustainable. Maybe the examples aren't actually great for that. Maybe it's okay that that's the case, but if you're running open source infrastructure for other things, then maybe that's quite difficult to do. And there's a bunch of other models as well. So Patreon, so if anyone's paid for anyone's time on YouTube, then it's the same model. You just pay for someone's contributions instead. Open Collective, which funds the collective organization around the project, and people can then expense stuff to it to cover certain things. So the chap behind Vue.js recently expense several $100s for lifts going between meetings, which we was pitching for Vue.js, and I imagine he wouldn't have been able to do that if he didn't have a way to cover that taxi cost. And additionally, there's a new organization called Tidelift, which is founded by one of the people who founded Red Hat. So Red Hat Enterprise Linux is one of the early things which had commercialized a piece of open source software, in this case, the Linux kernel. And they're trying to do stuff around infrastructure and perhaps pushing for support contracts, that kind of thing. So that's basically where we are. And here's some more resources of stuff that I've mentioned during, and then a bunch of other tools. And if you have any questions, I would love to try and answer them.
How would you sort of start going about trying to contribute to open source? Like, it feels rather intimidating.
Right, it makes you vulnerable, right? Someone's going to look at your code, perhaps. I'd start with issues and documentation. You come across something which isn't very clear, and more than likely is the case that the docs aren't very good, and that's a great way to do it. Other things are, if you come across just a bug that you can define well with a test, then you can test drive that, and that would be more likely to be contributed. But I basically wait for stuff to come along, but you see and find, this is painful for me, I'm going to try and contribute back, and that would be how I'd go about doing it.